the second session of the Environmental Justice Funder Community. I'm Liz Burley, a Program Officer at GMA Foundations, and I will be moderating today. Before we dive into the program, just a few housekeeping items. We'll be skipping the traditional introduction, so please be sure that your Zoom name is correct, or you can reach out to my colleague Judy Sneed in the chat for assistance. The session is being recorded. The recording and a synopsis will be shared with other funder community participants. This session will be held in a dual speaker format. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present, and we will conclude with a panel-style Q&A. While I ask that attendees remain on mute during the presentation, please feel free to type your questions into the chat as we go along. After the Q&A, we will say farewell to our speakers and allow time for the participants to debrief. Today, we're joined by Pen Lo and Kate Mangoya. Pen Lo is Senior Lecturer and Director of the Master of Public Policy Program and Community Practice at Tufts University, Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning. She partners with various community-based building organizations in the Solidarity Economy Initiative, Right to the City Alliance, and Center for Economic Democracy. Pen is the former Executive Director of Alternatives for Community and Environment, a Roxbury-based environmental justice group. He is currently a trustee of the Hyams Foundation and a board member of the Center for Economic Democracy. Kate Mangoya serves as Groundwork USA's Director of Capacity Building, leading their Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership. Climate Safe Neighborhoods is a data-informed organizing process that aims to reduce heat and flooding-related risks in neighborhoods with histories of institutional, race-based housing discrimination. After graduating from Reed College in Oregon, Kate taught middle school science in the Bronx, New York, earned a master's of city planning from MIT, and has served as the Director of Policy and Program Development for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Division of Public Housing and Rental Assistance. So without further ado, Pen, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So thanks for the intro. Thanks for inviting me. I recognize a couple of names here, but I'm going to be talking a bit in the beginning about some of the work that I experienced when I was with Alternatives for Community and Environment, ACE, where I was for about 13 years before coming over to teach at Tufts in the Urban Environmental Policy and Planning Department for the last 12. And I guess part of that is to help share some of the history of environmental justice as a movement. And one of the main storylines that's going to carry through this is how we started by fighting against the unfair and disproportionate environmental problems or bads, and how that has led to building towards sustainable and just communities and solidarity economies, or what some folks call a just transition. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I also wanted to say up front that one of the main themes here is that environmental justice and actually environmental issues themselves are not separate, but they're rather a part of intersectional set of problems that are rooted in the ways that we live, how we govern, how we relate to one another and to life's earth systems. So in other words, the environmental justice and environmental issues, including climate change that we focus on, are the symptoms of political and economic systems and cultures that produce both inequalities and unsustainabilities. Of course, these are systems that through history have deeply embedded forms of oppression, racism, classism, sexism, among others. And so to address the root causes, we try to take an approach that centers the people and the communities that are most impacted, and that focuses on building their power and capacity. So that's just wanted to kind of give you what I'm hoping you'll conclude by the end of my presentation. So just a little bit of history. Environmental racism, injustice, right? Calling out the disproportionate unfair burdening of lower income communities and communities of color. Of course, in Massachusetts, We don't escape these inequalities. The most comprehensive study done on this back from 2005 by Danny Faber and Eric Krieg over at Northeastern found extreme disparities. 24 of the 30 most environmentally overburdened communities are communities of color. High minority communities average 23 times more hazardous waste sites. And these just give you some photos of some of the sites that were among the ones that were counted. Also wanted to give you a sense of what this looked like in neighborhoods. These are all photos from Roxbury, where ACE is based. And by the late 1990s, there were a number of polluting abandoned facilities, like the electroplating photo here with two of our ACE youth leaders, Stanley and Tamika. But you can see that these are hazards that are really literally in people's backyards and front yards. So these are not something that are very separated. The environmental justice movement, when I ran into it in the early 90s, was a real revelation, right? Because the two key mottos of the movement, the environment is where we live, work, and play, really helped reframe environment from something that we think of as being out there beyond ourselves to something that we're a part of, and brings it right back home to the places where we live, work, and play. We speak for ourselves is another motto, and this really gets at one of the root causes of environmental injustice is the fact that certain communities do not have the power or ability to influence decisions that get made that determine where some of these hazards go. So wanted to work through, and I know at least a couple of you may know some of this and maybe even been on the tour that ACE gives. But the Clean Buses for Boston is a nice example of how we were fighting against environmental bad things and how community struggles actually resulted in some real change over time. So when we were working on this issue in the mid-90s, we knew that there was a lot of air pollution and public health problems that were related. One of the things that the medical and public health experts at the time were discovering was that asthma was actually an urban epidemic. And the hospitalization rates in Roxbury were 5 times the state average. We worked with young people to do some of their own investigations and community mapping to figure out what might be contributing to these disparities. They found 15 bus and truck depots in a 1.5 mile radius of what was then known as Dudley Square, now known as Nubian Square. And that included, I think, 2/3 of the MBTA's bus fleet. So, the young people started a campaign basically that turned into Clean Buses for Boston, and that over time helped win the conversion of the entire MBTA bus fleet to cleaner fuel alternatives. And they did this by wanting to highlight the fact that you can't idle your engine for more than 5 minutes in Massachusetts. That's actually against the law. Nobody actually knows the law. The law isn't really enforced, or it wasn't back then. And a lot of them lived across from some of these bus depots, including the MBTA, which would turn on their buses in the morning and idle for up to 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours. So they did their own anti-idling day. They marched from Eggleston Square to Dudley, handing out their own idling tickets, and really drew attention to this issue. But that helped launch a whole focus on clean buses, which we eventually brought a number of community and environmental organizations together to help achieve that. But it also launched the broader campaign, or actually not a campaign, but the T-Riders Union was launched back in 2000 as a result, because the dirty diesel pollution was just one facet of trying to improve the public transit system, right? So wanted to just make the point that environmental justice has never been about the equal distribution of pollution, right? But has always been about trying to address the overall problem so that no disproportionate burdens will flow down to those with the least economic and political power to resist them, because that's basically what happens in the process of environmental injustice. So in this case, fighting against dirty diesel pollution ended up improving the public transit system for everyone. And so I want to give a second case here. This is a campaign that ACE and many others were involved in starting from around 2008, 2009. The Green Justice Coalition, this is our version of green jobs. We were very inspired by the notion that we could help meet climate emissions goals, clean energy goals, while at the same time producing jobs for folks in our communities, as well as creating access to energy savings and saving on people's utility bills, right? And that's basically what the three goals were. We brought together, we were part of a coalition called Community Labor United, which brings together unions and community groups, and we brought in environmental groups as well. And this was a statewide coalition that over several years helped win some pretty incredible policies and programs in Massachusetts. We established some of the most ambitious energy savings targets amongst states in the US. The utilities had to invest $1.4 billion over 3 years into energy efficiency, and that's continued to this day. One of the really special things we did was try to make it work so that community mobilization initiatives forced utilities to actually work and partner with community groups to help identify households that needed these services, and also working with union contractors to hire and train folks from communities to actually do the work. And then we also won living wage standards and other responsible contractor agreements to ensure that these were good jobs. So this is, for us, really an example of a just transition strategy, right? Because we're talking about not just trying to solve one issue, but we're talking about really transforming the economy. And this is a framework that I'm showing the framework that Movement Generation, which is an organization based in Oakland, California, that has worked with the Climate Justice Alliance that ACE and others are a part of across the country, to develop this framework that talks about moving from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. I'm going to go through this rather quick, but I just wanted to kind of put it out there for you, right? So if we look at the extractive economy as being driven by a worldview of consumerism, of a colonial mindset, where resources are extracted, they're digged up, they're burned, and they're dumped, and then to a work process that relies on exploitation, where the result is basically trying to generate profit for the few, right? So enclosure of wealth and power. We're trying to shift that system into a regenerative economy, where a worldview is based on caring and sacredness, where we take a regenerative approach to resources, a cooperative approach to work, right? Democratic governance, and all in the service of creating more ecological and social well-being. Now, for us, the solidarity economies is one of the ways that we use to talk about what a just transition can look like. And also, so a lot of groups, including ACE and others, have been involved in trying to build towards solidarity economies, starting at the local level, right? And we can see from this chart here that the kinds of activities we talk about that are part of solidarity economy actually span the entire, all the economic sectors. And you start with the land creation, right, or resources. You go to production, and there's worker cooperatives of all kinds that can do that. There are all types of alternative ways to do exchange outside of just a market, right, including gifts, but also fair trade and local currencies. There's all types of ways that people can consume, again, also through co-ops, but also through self-provisioning and community-supported agriculture. The governance can be done in a deeply democratic way through things like participatory budgeting, which City of Boston has been doing for youth, and also City of Cambridge. And then what's really exciting is the surplus, right? So it's not just profit for the few, but hopefully surplus that gets recycled and reinvested to help keep the system going. Give you one example of what this looks like. The Cerro Cooperative was actually launched out of folks who were involved in the Green Justice Coalition. A number of folks wanted to build green jobs for themselves. And they got together and figured out that they could actually make a viable business collecting organic wastes and having them composted back into soil. And so this is the Cerro Cooperative, and we see them as part of a whole cycle of solidarity economy initiatives in the food economy, right? So if you look at, there are people doing growing of all kinds, right, that are not just growing for profit. There are people who are processing that. Commonwealth Kitchen being one of the more prominent ones, where people are developing local food businesses. There are efforts to try and get this type of food grown locally into local retail and restaurants. And then the organic waste that come out of this process get picked up by Cerro and then repurposed and put back onto the land. And on the land, we have things like community land trusts, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiatives, community land trust probably being the most prominent, but also recent ones like the Urban Farming Institute forming their own land trust. So I'm going to finish here with just a couple of, just reviewing some of the main themes. So I just want to say, again, environmental justice is an intersectional issue, right? That's rooted in racism and other systems of oppression. The political and economic systems that produce these inequalities in wealth and power also produce the environmental unsustainabilities. Right? There's really no way to unlink these. Therefore, we need an intersectional approach that centers people and communities most impacted, focuses on building their power and capacity, and dismantles systems of oppression. So a couple of takeaways for funders like yourselves: support organizing and invest in grassroots community organizations, right? All of these groups that, like ACE that we've been talking about, do that. Don't just look for the self-identified environmental or environmental justice groups, because a lot of groups working on environmental justice actually are groups that are formed to do other things, or to, otherwise involved in issues that are intersecting environment. Follow the lead of environmental justice communities and try to learn from them. And so how this translates into funding, providing general operating grants when possible, investing long-term with multi-year commitments when possible, and of course, building relationships of trust over time. I'm going to finish with just this slide showing that, we do have a number of initiatives where people are working on environmental justice. Of course, ACE is now getting close to 30 years doing this type of work. Love to see the generational transfer of leadership there. One of our youth, who was 14 when he came to us, is now the person running the youth program over at ACE. ACE's counterpart in Chelsea is called Green Roots. They're now 25 years in and have done all kinds of work to both stop bad things, but also creating new parks along the waterfront and creating access for the community. But there are groups that haven't been working on environment before that have now become environmental justice organizations. Neighbor to Neighbor Massachusetts had been an organization that did building civic power and voter engagement in communities of color across the Commonwealth. In Holyoke, they helped stop the Mount Tom coal plant and shut that down. That's now converted into a solar farm, and they're now working to make Holyoke, a green city. Viet Aid, Chinese Progressive Association, other organizations dedicated to serving the Asian American communities in the Boston area, they're now also involved. Urban heat islands is one of the things that is of concern to them, because people live in dense and often overcrowded conditions. And heat is actually one of the major impacts of climate change that are affecting them right now. So I'm going to stop there, because I think my time is up, and really look forward to getting into some questions and answers and discussion with you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Pen. That was a really informative presentation. Just as a reminder to folks, we are going to hold the questions till the panel discussion at the end, but if you have something on your mind right now, please feel free to go ahead and type that into the chat, and we'll get to it during the Q&A session.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Pen.
Kate.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Thank you for the opportunity to get to speak with you about what we're doing over at Groundwork USA. My name's Kate Mingoya Lafortune, and I am the Director of Capacity Building at Groundwork USA. And before we kick off, I actually wanted to open up with this picture of Cincinnati, Ohio. And if you're familiar with Cincinnati at all, this is in the Lower Price neighborhood, which is sort of in the bend of the Ohio River. And I want you to think to yourself, on a day that is really hot and muggy, like the kind we're going to experience in Boston over the next couple of days, like, where would you like to be hanging out? If you're like me, you probably want to be on the left-hand side of this dotted line. There's some grass, there are some trees, there's some swimming pools, but something you might notice about this image is that it's residential on both sides, but in the lower right-hand corner, you might see some dead trees in front of an apartment building. You see a little bit of heavy industry dotted in and a lot of asphalt on the right-hand side. And I like to use this picture to illustrate that the consequences of our changing climate, which are impacted by the access that we have to green infrastructure, is not being felt equally from country to country, from state to state within our country, from city to city within our states, not even from neighborhood to neighborhood, or even from block to block within our own cities. And that's not a coincidence. So Groundwork USA is the national support organization for 22 people-centered environmental justice organizations across the country. And I'm really excited to tell you that we've actually got 3 trusts in Massachusetts. Groundwork Lawrence, which is about an hour north on the commuter rail from Boston. Groundwork Somerville, which is where I'm talking to you from right now, and Groundwork South Coast, which is in Fall River and New Bedford, Massachusetts. And the work that we generally do is putting residents in the driver's seat about making changes to their built environment so that they can live in the clean and healthy spaces that they envision. And that's everything from helping to densify the urban tree canopy cover by acting as the urban forester, to taking over plots of contaminated land and transforming it into community assets. So things like parks and trails and urban farms, stuff like that. And over the past 5 years, we've started to focus our work into climate mitigation. How do we keep the residents that live in our communities safe from the climate crisis, specifically from extreme heat and extreme precipitation? And we got the chance to ask this really cool question. Is there a relationship between historical race-based housing segregation, and we use redlining as a proxy for that, and modern day risk to extreme heat and precipitation? And so we pulled together 13 of the cities that are in our network, so 13 of these trusts, to form a partnership to dig into this issue and figure out, if it's true, what do we do about it? And I'm going to take a really quick pit stop into redlining. I'm pretty sure everyone on this call knows what it is, but I want to explain the nuance because it'll be relevant to why we do the things that we do later. So if I can take you on a time travel back to the 1930s, back to the Great Depression, people are suffering, they don't have enough resources, and there's actually a huge eviction crisis that we don't talk a lot about that was looming. Back in the 1920s and 30s, you didn't have the 20-year mortgage that you have today. You usually got a 5-year mortgage, you would pay down the debt over those 5 years, and at the end of the 5 years, you'd have a really big balance that you would then need to get another mortgage for. But by 1933, about 50%, that's 50% of those mortgages were actually in default. So the federal government decided to figure out, how do we loosen that lending, because the banks were not giving out loans for those big balances anymore. And so they developed the federally backed mortgage, and that basically says, hey, banks, if you folks lend to this person over here, we vouch for them, and if they default, we're going to pick up the tab. But the federal government was working with taxpayer dollars, so they had to figure out, how do we make it so that the investments that we're making, the backings that we're making, are safe bets for these tax dollars. So they sent people to survey cities that usually had about 100,000 or more people in them, to develop these residential security, also known as redlining maps. Neighborhoods that had the right kind of white person, because we know definitions of whiteness change over time, were outlined in green. And also had wealthier folks and higher quality housing stock. Those were green lined or outlined in green. Those are A-grade neighborhoods. And neighborhoods that had people of color, had lower quality housing stock, or low income families and immigrants. Those were outlined in red. And it's kind of a tough problem if you're in one of these red line neighborhoods. If you're living there and you want to buy a house, you don't have access to this federally backed mortgage, this ability to stretch your debt over a very long period of time, 20 to 30 years. And so it's going to be really hard for you to be able to afford a house. If you're someone who already owns a home or owns property in that redlined area, your property values are going to be depressed because you can't sell. Folks who buy in those neighborhoods don't have access to that mortgage, so you're going to have to accept less for your property or hold on to it. And if you're a family, say you're a Black family that has the money to live in one of these green line neighborhoods, no one in the green lined area is going to sell to you, because they don't want to reduce the access of people in that area to getting these federally backed mortgages, because it would reduce their housing prices. And what we see over time is that there becomes a financial disincentive for the cities to invest in these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods that are redlined lack in political power, because it's predominantly Black, brown, immigrant, low-income folks who live there, and they're actually not adding a ton to the coffers because their property values are so depressed. So we see cities not upgrading sewage infrastructure. We see them not citing parks there. We see them not planting trees, and that has really long-term consequences. And every once in a while, someone asks me like, Kate, are you sure that it's about race? Because if the housing quality stock is bad, why would the federal government want to back a mortgage? And I highly encourage you folks to head to the Mapping Inequality website, where you get to find out what was the government's rationale for citing things. And this one's my favorite. It's from Richmond, Virginia. It is a C-graded neighborhood, which is just a step above Redline. And the clarifying remarks are, that's why they graded it C. Respectable people, but homes are too near the Negro area D2. That means that proximity to Blackness, just proximity to it, was enough to remove an economic opportunity, was enough to remove opportunity for infrastructure development in your part of the city. And credit to Jeremy Hoffman on this one. If you actually do a word cloud of all the different ways that they described A and B lined, that's green and blue lined neighborhoods, you've got some pretty good words in there. Wooded and landscaped and hilltops. But if you do the same thing for these C and D neighborhoods, you see some pretty nasty words: manufacturing, odors, sewers, hot. And I want to be very clear that redlining didn't cause, but it did codify pre-1917 patterns of race-based housing segregation. And so I'm going to show you an image that we use really frequently in our work in climate-safe neighborhoods. It's a map of Elizabeth, New Jersey. And as a quick reminder, the green squares, you're going to see a redlining map digitized on a map of Elizabeth, New Jersey. Green is the right kind of white person. D is usually people of color, lower income families. And I want you to keep your eye on any green polygon. Doesn't matter where it is, just keep your eye on any green polygon. This is a tree canopy cover as of 2016. Permeable pavement, so think like asphalt, parking lots, driveways. And this is relative heat, with red being the hottest. Now find any red polygon, doesn't matter where it is, just keep your eye on it. Again, tree canopy cover as of 2016. Impermeable pavement, so parking lots, driveways, a lot of asphalt. And then relative heat, with red being the hottest. You're probably seeing a relationship, but in case the eye test is not doing it for you, I got a bar graph for you. As you go from A to D, again, those green lined to red lined areas, we see across our climate safe neighborhood cities that the land surface temperature goes up, that the impervious surface goes up, and this is my least favorite, that tree canopy cover precipitously declines. And Jeremy Hoffman and Vivek Chandas did a study that shows on average within a city, formerly red line neighborhoods today are about 4.5 degrees hotter than their formerly green line counterparts, but that can be as extreme as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the difference between sitting on your porch on a summer evening and ending up in the hospital with heat stroke. That's the difference between a $100 cooling bill at the end of July and a $250 one that you can't afford. It's the difference between your kid playing outside with their friends in the summer or having to stay inside because you're afraid they're going to suffer an asthma attack. And today, about 75% of those neighborhoods that were formerly redlined are still low to moderate income, and about 2/3 of them are minority neighborhoods. So as James Baldwin said, the past is not past. At this point, if you've studied anything related to race relations in the United States, you're probably disappointed, but not terribly surprised by what I'm telling you. But you might be wondering, what happened if my community wasn't redlined? And I like the example of Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is a former textile mill city, planned city that's just north of Boston, about an hour on the commuter rail. And Lawrence actually was never redlined. It had a lot of different immigrants that mixed and mingled in different buildings, but the areas surrounding, the suburban areas surrounding Lawrence were redlined, which means that those with the financial and the racial means to leave Lawrence were able to get advantage of these intergenerational wealth building opportunities. And if you look at Lawrence compared to these suburban areas, we see a really similar pattern. This is tree canopy cover as of 2016, impervious surface, again, driveways, parking lots. This is relative heat, with red being the hottest. And I threw this in for good measure. This is households in poverty. So we see this a lot. At this point, you might be saying, Kate, I got it. You gave me the solution. The solution is to get trees in the ground and to plant things. Oh, not really. I mean, definitely encourage planting and fund planting initiatives. They're very, very important. But this is actually my street. I can see this tree outside my window. And until 3 years ago, our street didn't have any trees on it. And the city of Somerville finally planted this tree, and it's going to be awesome in about 5 to 10 years. Right now, it's casting a shadow that's about the size and shape of a pizza box. So it's not doing a ton to cool the neighborhood. The other thing you might notice, and this is a problem across a lot of formerly red and yellow line cities, is you notice those power lines, those actually limit how high the trees can grow. And all of these trees are dwarf trees, which means we'll never have the tree canopy cover of a suburban neighborhood because of that infrastructure. So instead of just planting things, again, do that thing, but you should also be asking, well, why has this why hasn't this been changed already? Why has change not yet come about? And that's what we're doing in our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, is digging into that question and trying to change it. And the crux of our work is to organize residents so that they can self-advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources by intervening in the systems that have allowed that harm to be perpetuated for the last 60, 100, 200 years. And it's a 3-year process that we undertake. The first is using these maps and these digital images to understand, why do our neighborhoods look the way that they do? Yes, there's a federal history there, but there's also usually a really rich local history that we need to understand. The second place is to work really closely with residents to help understand their priorities for how they'd like their cities to look different, to do power analyses, and to understand the alliances that we need to build. And then the final piece is to work with residents to build their capacity to lead an organizing campaign and self-advocate for change so that there's a more equitable distribution of resources. I'm going to give you 2 quick examples before I launch into what you folks can do to help. This is in Denver, Colorado, where ballot 2A was passed, which created a steady stream of funding for the development of parks and resources. And we work really closely in Denver with the Globeville neighborhood, which is a former lead smelting plant location. The entire neighborhood is a super fun site, predominantly Latina, and is a neighborhood with a lot of environmental justice concerns. Well, the city decided, hey, we're actually not going to invest that money in these environmental justice communities. We're just going to put them into other neighborhoods. So residents were really upset about that. And we developed an intervention academy where we work closely with residents. And in the first year of the academy, we had 10 promotoras, so Latina members of the community, who learned about things like, why do you have a city councilor and a mayor? How does the budget cycle work? Who makes these decisions and how do you intervene? And then a really cool chance came up where about $40 million is now being spent in Denver per year on GI funds. Of the 10 graduates of the program that we had, 6 applied to be on the board that the city of Denver is using to distribute those funds. 4 were accepted, and 1 of them is currently the co-chair. In Richmond, Virginia, we had a youth-centered community engagement program where we had a mix of data, citizen science data collection, and door-to-door knocking and organizing to get residents involved in the Richmond 300 planning process. Richmond, Virginia just went through its development of its 10-year master plan. And we were able to use these maps to compel residents to come out and deeply engage with the process. And we're able to secure some resident-led funded, which is a really important part of this, funded and codified changes to the master plan that prioritize effectively formerly redlined communities that are hotter and wetter for the installation of tree canopy cover and flood mitigation green infrastructure. So these maps can be a really powerful tool to affecting community change. The one thing I want to say is that there's no panacea, there's no 100% magic wand solution. At best, we're going to get 101% solutions. But how do we build the infrastructure so that there's more 1% solutions? Here's some of the takeaways that we have. The first piece is to democratize that data. I mentioned the residents in Denver, but I didn't mention this part. We have this really cool dashboard, and I can send out the link if you want to poke around, but it allows residents to look in more detail, neighborhood by neighborhood, into different environmental indicators. And it was actually a resident who was poking around in these maps and said, hey, wait a minute. My neighborhood has 1% tree canopy cover, but if I get on a bus and take it to the other side, I get off that bus and I'm in a neighborhood with 24% tree canopy cover. And if I walk a couple more blocks, I'm in a neighborhood with 60% tree canopy cover. They brought this to the city and said, you need to explain the difference. And 2 results came out of that. First is residents had a really concrete ask that they were able to develop. We want 10,000 trees in 10 years and a say in funding distribution. And the second piece is it developed a tool to say, why is this still the case? Why has this change not yet come about, City of Denver? And so the City of Denver is working this last couple of years and planting the first 3,000 trees. So this data can have really concrete results. 2, use these maps as a neutral platform for conversations about equity. We don't know how to talk about race in our culture. We're not super great at it yet. And these maps, while they address issues of race and the climate crisis, they allow people to respond to the unfairness in a way that is neutral. So we're not talking about what you have done or what you haven't done. We're talking about that there's a really glaring problem. We need to explain why it is, and we need to fix it. Why is it that the northern part of Richmond, where it's majority Black residents, is a lot hotter than the southern and western parts of the city? And then the final piece is having community buy-in. When I was, after I finished going to college, I came back to New York, which is where I was raised. And it was during Bloomberg's Million Trees campaign where they're trying to plant 1 million trees. And one day there were no trees. The next day, there were a bunch of trees planted. And the third day, all of the tops of the trees were snapped off. And there was a woman who lived on the first floor of my building. She was kind of that auntie who was always peeking out the window, like looking at everybody, and, you know, had a sense of the neighborhood's comings and going. And I talked to her about it, and she said, well, nobody asked me. And it was actually residents who had snapped those off because they felt as though nobody was asking them about changes to their neighborhood. So we take a very people-centered approach to make sure that residents are setting that agenda. And the last thing that I'll say, and this is where you folks can get involved, is that you've probably seen a lot of studies over the past year connecting redlining to things that are disappointing, like childhood asthma, maternal mortality, the urban heat island effect. But you might be wondering why there isn't more progress if we have all of this data. One, I think that an opportunity for funders is to invest in some of the technical infrastructure. Most people are not able, have not taken a GIS course and can't put together maps about the things they're curious in, but having access to these technical resources serves as a platform for conversations about equity. The second piece is that I actually think maps are not super useful unless you have someone to interpret them and connect them into the story of place. So funding this community organizing work is a really important way to help connect the technical resources to the soul and the heart of the community so that people can start to envision a future. And then finally, it's important to invest in the long-term success of these residents. Stick with folks over a longer period of time. One final example that I'll give is in Denver, a number of the residents who are on that board are facing a lot of pretty nasty race-based discrimination from other members of the board, other members of the folks who are part of this decision-making capacity. So it's important to stick with them. Once we have that change, we need to see the change through into its final implementation. So that was a lot. I just hit you with a fire hose. Thanks for being willing to get a little bit wet. Looking forward to chatting more about it. Check out our website, and please feel free to email me if you want to talk further, kate@groundworkusa.org.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was fantastic. Pen, I'm just going to spotlight your video here so we can see you both, I hope. And all right, we can go right into the Q&A session. Myron, I see that you posted in the chat. Would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Inevitably, even though 501c3s are limited in straight political activity, educational campaigns are important goals from my perspective that we can actively support. As I said in the chat, we're, I hope, at a transformational moment in local politics here in Massachusetts. Certainly the city of Boston, mayoral and city council races, next year's gubernatorial races could lead to some, I hope, far more progressive and diverse leaders. Are there specific campaign agendas from an environmental justice viewpoint that you think should reasonably be on the table that we can help communities pressure candidates about? What's realistic to get started on if we're at a change moment?
Yeah, I think there are two pieces that you can take a look at. One is anything related to the installation of green infrastructure, and I mean that from a heat mitigation and a stormwater perspective. If you look at any of the maps about what Boston Metro is going to look like related to the Mystic River or the harbor, it's deeply disturbing, especially when you overlay it with the people who are going to be most impacted by it. So I think any sort of platforms that really push for better installation of green infrastructure and sort of a more advanced installation of it. So that, you know, tiny baby 2-inch tree that I've got, that's not going to cut it. We need something that's more robust. And I think the second place, and this is a little bit squishy, but like stick with me here. I promise it's worth it to get through the squish, but changes in the way that decisions are made. I've been a bureaucrat. I worked for the state of Massachusetts for Charlie Baker. And so understand the way that these bureaucrats are really useful and these technocrats are useful in making these decisions, but there needs to be a more authentic distribution of authentic shared leadership and decision-making with communities that are being harmed. And that can be codified. That's something that we can put into law. That's something we can put into policy that leaves a certain amount of money or a certain amount of decision-making power to actually sit with residents. Residents know best about what changes need to come to their community. And if you're not working closely with them, you're gonna get those snap trees like there were in Harlem. So those are my two top priorities.
Thanks, Kate. Really want to second those as well. But I'm really excited just because there's things that are getting onto the political agenda that through these campaigns are giving more visibility to. I'm just going to mention two. They might not happen, but I think we're going to take some real steps to work towards them. One is making T buses free. You know, the idea of free transit was, I remember when the T Riders Union first got going, we used to laugh at that idea, and it's actually on the agenda now, and it's actually being piloted in a number of regional transit authorities, and there's a pilot going on the MBTA right now. But why not system-wide? Rent control is another statewide one, where, you know, it was defeated in the mid-90s because well, everyone in places that had rent control voted for it, and everyone else, enough people outside of it voted against. But trying to get that back would be a major tool in the fight against displacement, which I think is kind of the current legacy. That's the fight of today that is part of the legacy of redlining that Kate was speaking about. So I'll just mention those two things. I think there's a lot that ought to and still needs to be done to make sure that there's equal protection, right? There was finally in state legislation, environmental justice got codified just this past spring, even though the states had an environmental justice policy for the last 20 years. But I think there's still a lot more that can be done just to make sure that places that are already overburdened have more tools to prevent further overburdening.
Thank you both. Anyone else like to submit a question to our wonderful panel? Judy?
So yesterday, big news, the UN's report, and you know, it feels like one of the headlines said that, you know, the world is burning, and now what? What's your strategy for involving people in communities? If you know what, or if you're not directly involved with it, what should it be to involve people who are most affected, who are really going about their day and just trying to, you know, make a living and feed their families? What do you think we should be getting on? What effort should we be getting underneath to make the world's on fire kind of come from the communities?
Thanks, Judy. I can try to take a first shot at that. I have a lot to say about this, but I think to me, there's, you know, I mean, one is just to say that this evidence has been in place for over 30 years at the very least. So, you know, none of this should be a surprise to anyone. But I think that the way that climate issue has been constructed and framed as an environmental issue does it a disservice, right? It creates an impression that perhaps it's not as related to the daily struggles, right? That a lot of folks in environmental justice communities are going through, when in fact it is intimately connected. And so there's a lot. So I'll just give you one example. Viet I was doing a project with that they're still doing to try and do a climate justice kind of grassroots planning project. And the first step was simply to find out, you know, how well does the Vietnamese American community in Dorchester actually, you know, relate to climate issues? How would they define them, right? And the first thing we discovered over this past year was that just a basic understanding of climate change and global warming is actually, there's not that high a literacy. But the impacts are something that people understand quite a bit. And that includes the heat island effect, that includes, you know, disruptions due to extreme weather that in fact are exactly the same type of disruptions people have been experiencing through COVID. You know, loss of access to services, jobs, and, you know, so all of these things, I think there are ways to work on this. We just don't have to, I hate when people say climate is the biggest threat to humanity, like ever. You know, I mean, I kind of agree with that on one level, but on the other hand, you know, it is part of, it's not the only issue out there. It shouldn't be a master frame for everything else. But climate is actually the reason we're seeing these is because, like I said before, of all the different ways that we are running our economies that are also, making people poor, that are, having people in crowded housing conditions or being displaced out of where they're living or their home countries. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I'm going to second pieces of that. Thanks, Penn. When we were starting our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, we did a lot of door-to-door knocking to understand what folks' concerns are. And that was part of coming up with a strategy of not just who is impacted, but what are the different ways they're impacted. So Mary, who's owned her building across the street from me for like 70 something years, is going to have different experiences and different climate related concerns than the unionized municipal landscaping crews that are working for the city. So how do we really understand what those priorities are? And folks really do have a good handle on that. We would talk this one story from Rhode Island, which I think is just wild, as this woman was talking about the impact on her dog. She used to take her dogs for walks around lunchtime, and it now gets so hot in the afternoon that she has to move her dogs like walk time up to 10 a.m. because it was burning the dog's paws. We also talked to folks who said like, oh yeah, I used to be able to hang out on my front porch and watch the kids play, and that was a big part of my mental and social health and the fabric of our community. Now it's too hot and my heart acts up, so I have to sit inside. So understanding that there's social fabric consequences, there are economic comfort consequences like the dog. There's also economic consequences. When we think about flooding, I think folks think about this big wave of water washing cars away, and that's a very dramatic interpretation. But there's a lot of insidious flooding that impacts people's health and the way they live their homes. An example of this is in Rhode Island, in Pawtucket, which is just outside of Providence, where there's a problem with sewage just like backflowing into people's homes and messing up their drywall. And like, that's really expensive to fix. And landlords aren't always going to fix it if you're in your rental unit. And now your stuff is destroyed with sewage. How do you recover from that? So there are all of these sort of 1% problems that build up into 100% understanding of what the climate crisis is. And so I think giving folks a really clear and I think that there's sort of two ways to think about it. There's kind of the carbon reduction fight, which I'm not a huge part of, but then there's I have accepted that we are a certain amount of like baked into the climate crisis, and how do we make it so that folks are able to survive? And I think that these two groups work really closely together, but they are kind of discrete issues on like the pessimism spectrum, and just understanding how do we keep folks' survival. And I think part of that is related to what I was presenting, is being able to make specific asks about change. We need the sewage infrastructure fixed in Pawtucket, not because it's 2021 and we should have a functioning sewer system in the United States, but because it's destroying people's drywall and like messing all their stuff up, and they have to stick with smelly carpets, and that's not safe for their breathing health. And just trying to address each one of these problems with a really clear and specific ask. I think there's been this really big emphasis on big data and taking big data and crunching it into all these different places, like mazel tov to the people who figured out how to do that. But there's an element of small data that really matters too, of connecting the numbers that we know to the impact, to the stories, to the people, and that's going to make it really tangible and real, and that's where we're going to see progress.
Thank you both. I think Phil has a question.
Yeah, I just have a question about the people power of these environmental justice communities, which are, codified by our state, Massachusetts. And if you look at state figures, these EJ communities are densely populated. They have a lot of votes, a lot of people, a lot of nonprofit innovation, and just trying to put an optimistic spin on things. In the old days of philanthropy, back in the days of big liberal government, philanthropy would do all these kind of pilot projects, which then would prove themselves, and then the government would take it over and everything would be great. That was the theory. But you could imagine in communities where the environmental stress is so high already, it's already at these scary levels of heat and poor air quality and water problems, where with political power, you could do some very cool things there that might lead the way for the rest of the country and the world. Would you buy into that sort of optimistic viewpoint of what is really not an optimistic story?
I don't think that we're hopeless or helpless at this point, even though about 60% of the presentation that I shared with you guys is probably really depressing. Sorry about that. I hope I tried to bring it around at the end by saying that there is ability in that people power. And I think, to Penn's point, there's this misunderstanding that folks don't really care about these issues. I think that they care about these issues primarily, and that there is a lot of power. I think one of the biggest hurdles, and I think foundation communities can help with this, is the systems are not designed to be really accessible, and the systems are not designed to be intervened in, and I believe that's intentional. I personally believe that's intentional. And so helping to develop the capacity of residents to be able to create and launch their own solutions instead of waiting for someone else to come along and maybe get to their city and maybe get help at the state level or at the federal level. That sort of independence is important, and it's going to matter. I don't think that we're at a place in our political culture or history where we're going to get broad consensus on how to tackle the problems in Phoenix and in Bangor, Maine, in similar ways. So I think those local based solutions are something that's going to be really important. And that means we need to give folks the tools that they need to be able to understand the problem in different ways. Those people who are in Globeville understood that their neighborhood was hotter. They understood that it was uglier because there's no tree canopy cover. There's a lot of pavement and gravel there, and folks got that, but they didn't understand the difference between 1% and 60%. And when you have that deep understanding, that allows you to have really specific asks for change, which is the key to, I think, surviving part of this climate crisis, is being really specific about what we need. And also that put people kind of, for lack of a better term, puts people's back against the wall for a second to say, like, why is this still like this? Aren't you the one who's responsible for fixing this? So I think developing that people power from that grassroots level and keeping it small but connected to other folks is, I think that the way we're gonna do it. I would love to see that big, investment from all different levels of private and public and things like that. But I think for where we are now, we got to really invest in that people power.
Yeah, Phil, my only hope for the future is the fact that we can build people power at the local level. I think that's a necessary ingredient for anything that we're trying to solve. But I am excited about some of the possibilities. I think that if you look at how that political power building has progressed in some of our communities, including the ones that I was sharing with you, it is not the same as it was 20 years ago. And there are more candidates that are more connected to these movements, and some who are coming directly out of them. So I see that as really promising, as opposed to, so I think no matter who ends up in office, right, communities still need to be organized, still need to be able to, even if it's someone who is their friend and ally or coming out of their own community, they still, those people will be under immense pressures from all kinds of groups. And so communities can never really let up on this. And, so I think the sobering point is not that there's going to be a quick fix, that this has to be an ongoing and permanent struggle of establishing and exercising power. But at the end of the day, I think that's the only solution to these deeply embedded, dismantling racism, right, is not just going to happen by electing a person of color into office. And we know that now. We've known that. It's going to take a lot more than that.
Can I do a quick follow-up?
So we have time for one more question, I think, Phil.
Are others in line here? Don't let me steal the spot.
Seeing any hands raised?
What I just didn't hear from either of you, and I thought it was striking, was anything about enforcement, litigation. Again, going back to these environmental justice communities, there's certain rights that people have, and I think they've become even more clearly defined in recent times. When you call in the big guns and take the state to court or whoever, and why didn't you talk about that so much today in an advocacy session?
Phil, I'll take a first shot. I'd be really curious what Kate would say, since she's been in state government. But I guess what I've found is that at the grassroots level, there's not as many fights that are just about keeping something really bad from happening because the rules aren't in place or aren't being enforced. We were seeing a lot more of those fights in the mid to late 90s. And it's not to say that those fights don't exist, they do, but I would say, you know, it's kind of like regulating at the tailpipe, right? It's like trying to, a harm is already being produced and you're trying to figure out how to mitigate it, right? As opposed to, you know, can you build the power to try to change the system so that we're not producing as much of that harm in the first place? And I think that's where a lot of the efforts that I'm involved in are headed. I'd also like to think that perhaps, you know, we don't have some of the extreme cases, and that's a good thing because we're not spending as much of our energy trying to fight off, you know, just horrible cases of, you know, people being dumped on or polluted on. But I, you know, I'm hopeful that that's the case, and yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you ask Phil, why don't we bring out the big guns? The big guns are really slow to move. It takes a real long time to get that out of the shed or wherever you store your big guns. And I think that instead of, and the other thing is that these processes are not always people-centered. And I think that that's a really big shift and a big approach is from seeing this as a big problem that just government or just the law needs to tackle, and then sort of flipping it to saying that this is not working. It's really hard to have one body make a really nuanced decision for a relatively small group of people, and that this needs to be people-centered. It needs to be a people-centered approach. That's why I always describe Groundwork as a people-centered environmental justice organization. The environment in itself sort of matters discretely, but how people are experiencing it matters, and you can't get that experience until you're talking to them. And I think that the other thing that the legislation or that the litigation doesn't necessarily always tap on is, why has this change not yet come about? It's about the enforcement of something that's already been decided upon, but not necessarily poking into that big system. One of the reasons why you might say, like, Kate, I already knew about redlining, why did you spend so much time on it? Is I think people don't necessarily get the nuance that a lot of these decisions that we've made, a lot of these laws had some really good intentions to it. If 50% of your country is about to be evicted, like, it's probably a really good thing to create a federally backed mortgage, but there's a lot of externalities. And I think that happens on the litigation side and on the legislation side, where there are these externalities that we don't always understand because we haven't talked and let people lead that. People are really good at spotting out the, oh, if you do X, did you know it's going to impact me in Y way? Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional. So I think that's why we take that approach of really wanting to be people-centered and to probe at that question of, why has that change not yet come about, and what can residents do to make that change happen? And government runs so slow. I remember being really frustrated. It was like 28 when I started working for the government, and I was like, why does everything move so slow? And I realized that it's important that it does in some ways, because it gives people a chance to intervene. I had like an awakening there about like the role of government in that way. But yeah, like to be on this side where things can move a little bit faster.
Well, if no one else has a burning question, I will take the floor for myself here. And I'd be very curious to know what you both think are the greatest opportunity for influencing the distribution of infrastructure funds that are now available.
I can just say that I think this is a case where, similar to when the stimulus happened under Obama after the Great Recession, it was like things that had already been queued up, worked on, and ideas developed were the ones that could tap in most quickly. So I'm expecting that that's going to be the case again now. But that also, you know, argues, I think, for making sure that we aren't just reacting to crises and emergencies, and that we're doing the work of trying to plan ahead. You know, what do our communities need, and how do we develop these ideas so that when opportunities like this come along, you know, folks are ready to jump on them.
And being able to support some of these small, Penn described a lot of organizations that are not necessarily environmental justice organizations, but are working on things that touch infrastructure. Sometimes it's hard to get those people connected into those larger funding sources, especially if they're being distributed by the states. And so it's really important to make sure that that stuff actually does trickle down to the folks who are on the front line and that are able to reinvest that in communities.
Thank you both. Any final burning questions, folks, before we say farewell? Okay, well, and Kate, thank you very much for joining us today. I greatly appreciate your experience and your time. Thank you very much. And if the rest of the
Sorry,
participants would please stay on the line.
Myron, did you have a question?
Well, I just want to emphasize so much of what philanthropy can do is spread the education. There are some groups we've talked about, Green Roots and CPA and some parts of the Dudley crowd of organizations that are doing a good job. But there are a lot of areas of the city of impacted communities, EJ communities that aren't getting the message. And it seems to me philanthropy could take a role in expanding the knowledge base, getting the education more broadly disseminated, or helping community-based organizations that do it well to reach out and support how others are taught and trained.
I think so. I think that's a really great point because there's a lot of really novel stuff that's coming up right now as we have more access to data, as we're more greatly connected, as we find out that the people are really interested in these issues that cross-cut with a variety of justice issues. We do have a really huge opportunity to take those learnings and make them available. And I actually personally think that a lot of this stuff is replicatable. The work that we've been doing at Groundwork USA, one of the reasons why we're working in places from Cincinnati to San Diego is to figure out, is this something you can do in a small city and in a big city and in a Midwestern city and in a Southern city? And so I've been really thankful for the support that we've gotten to be able to spread that around and sort of test run that to see if it can work in these different social, cultural, racial, economic, political environments. And I think there's lots of organizations that are doing that sort of stuff and just need some help getting it out into the world. So yeah, I agree quite a bit with that.
Okay, well, with that, I think we will bid our speakers farewell. Thank you both again. It was a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, everybody. Great to meet you all.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, and thanks for staying on the line, everyone else. We have a few minutes left to debrief if you'd like to share your thoughts or if there are any questions that you have queued up for our next session, if you're thinking ahead. The floor is open to everyone. Go ahead, Lavinia. Oh, you're on mute right now.
I didn't want to bring this up, but this just drove me crazy. Yesterday in the paper, there was on the front page in the Globe, front page of the second section, about an area of Roxbury, maybe, where there was a church, there is a church, they're selling the land to Lincoln, and they're going to put up housing for 270 people, build it up. It's in the woods. It's a woods area that people have grown up with. And I kind of know where it is, but I can't say it. And I'm sure someone else knows much more about this and can tell me they've been fighting this for years. I don't know. I just couldn't believe I'd never seen it before. It's, where is it? I don't know where it is. And I was going to go try to find my newspaper, and I thought I got to stick hear what you're saying. I'll write to Phil, and Phil will know, and he'll tell me. Then I'll feel better.
We'll look it up. So
Lavinia, I read that also, and I'm on the planning board. I'm on the planning board in the town that I live on. So there's always this, but it's private property, and the church that's selling the land needs the money to pay their debts. They only have 5,000 people in their congregation. And this developer is going to solve all of their problems. And we have a housing crisis. So it's this really complex problem.
Yes,
And
I can imagine
to me, like the BRA, is that the authorizing organization?
that.
Myron probably knows, but it seems to me that somebody needs to be advocating for a big chunk of open space being maintained for that community.
Yeah, a big chunk of space that once you cut those trees down, they're gone. And
Right.
once you've put all that stuff on the ground, it's gone. You can't get rid of it. It's there. It just drove me crazy. I can't believe I guess what people are saying is the city has to buy it. And why doesn't the city buy it? Why not? Why can't we? And I really like the ending there where people said, philanthropy can solve a lot of problems. Just, some of us come forward with our money and something may happen. I don't know, but I just know. And Kate talked about trees, and I really care about trees, and I think they're really important.
I mean, part of the problem is that there is no master plan for the city of Boston. The BRA, now the Boston Planning Development Authority, has avoided doing any comprehensive master planning. So the idea that there are areas to be preserved, green space,
Right.
many other functional aspects don't have a comprehensive look and don't have a well-organized mechanism for local community involvement. It's very much spotty depending on a particular proposal of a developer, typically, that then gets a response. Certainly one of the major factors that should emerge from the next round of the mayoral election and city council, and I know several candidates are supporting this, is we need to have a better system, replace the way the BPDA has operated, so you can have planned protections of green areas, or where it is appropriate to develop more housing, which is obviously also a need.
Thank you. Thank you for telling me.
So Myron, the BRA, the BPDA has immense power, right?
Incredible power, except the way it uses its power is by spot negotiation with developers. It's always motivated by immediate local opportunities and the money that significantly comes out of that. The city has money that it could use that comes out of it. It needs a comprehensive plan how to take advantage.
How would you restructure it politically, given that it has power?
That may be a complicated area, but I mean, clearly to have, well, one of the things that's been talked about for years is separating the development guidance and control from the planning power. That's Boston is unique
Yes.
in the country, where it combines those two powers in the same agency for the last 70 years. And that's crazy. We need a planning approach that reflects the needs of the citizenry. And then there's a separate role that, in a way, it's implementing the goals of that larger picture that relate to specific development prospects. I don't know the details of how that should structure, but that's the starting point.
And it would be interesting to circle back to our chief of the environment with that question, Lavinia.
Yes.
Just here's an opportunity maybe for you to influence something here in the city, and how would you do it?
Yeah, but it's huge. It's huge, is what he's telling us, because it's always been this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Crazy.
And any big takeaways from this session?
Really.
I mean, I most liked the very clear emphasis, not that it was necessarily new, but it's wonderfully clarified, to tie the whole concept of environmental justice to, and environment per se, to the sort of the broad range of justice issues, and whether that's housing or tree cover or traffic and transit, that they're all integrated, and environmental justice is really a comprehensive attitude, not a separate sort of climate related or open space related thinking process.
It also reminded me from the philanthropy side of things that I see hundreds of grant applications every year. And it is so important that we ensure these organizations are doing their part in connecting with the community that they're trying to serve. and actually providing services that the community wants. So just remembering that as we go about our regular due diligence and making grants.
And Liz, I was going to say, you see all these grants every year and we sort of classify them as community development or the environment or education. And we're kind of past that, right? The education grants and the housing grants and the environment grants kind of have to be the same.
Yeah, and I think there's enormous overlap with community development groups. You know, Boston has these great health centers. There's another overlap, but a wonderful network of community development corporations. We're going to hear from Codman Square next month, and they're going great gangbusters on environmental stuff, and I think that'll be interesting. But yeah, I remember early on, we were researching this and I did call up Penn Low and he kind of gave me an earful saying, don't put this into buckets and don't just environmentalize everything, because this really has to do with people and sort of a holistic sense of life, real people who have real needs, and environment permeates a lot of that. So, anything else we learned from today that we should remember as we ultimately we're going to make a few grants here?
Well, I'll just say I did love the story that Kate shared about Bloomberg having the kind of the tree campaign, and then all the trees, tops of the trees got chopped off. And I think it's such a great example of why it's so important to bring the community in from the beginning. So you really don't just plant trees because you think it's the right thing to do, but you plant trees because the community said they want trees in their community. So I love that little anecdote. I thought it was really powerful, and something to carry forward as we're thinking about projects to support.
I thought the maps were really good. At first I thought, oh, come on, what am I looking at these maps? But the maps really show it, show the deal. And I would think that if you went and met with a community group who were mad over this or mad over that, and you bring in the maps, then they begin to see it. And as Penn said, 1% versus 60%, they didn't quite get that. But if they can see in color, I think that would be very, very effective.
Great, you know, maps are great, and they often just tell the story. Been watching this group, a new group called Speak for the Trees. They seem to do a lot of mapping. But anyway, I asked this director, you know, Boston's a very green city. And I read these proposals and Boston ranks pretty high in terms of park and all that stuff. He said, yes, but when you get down to the sort of granular neighborhood level, it's a completely different story and we can map it and show you. And that's what they do, partly.
You know, and the one thing that I heard actually that made this very clear to me, even though it's obvious, is that there's two different things going on here in the environment. One is the carbon reduction fight, and then the other one is making sure people survive. And it feels like, you know, this fund is on the making sure people survive side.
You know, just reading these climate reports, you can see that it's so uneven in life, and that many neighborhoods now are already at the point of no return, according to the UN. You know, way over the 2 degrees Celsius and experiencing really horrible effects. So then the resilient side versus the mitigation becomes as important, and we'll see this with flooding in Boston as well.
Phil, what you just said raises a question in my mind. I know a number of years ago, Boston produced a resiliency plan that related, I think, heavily to shoreline mitigation measures or responsive measures. But that was a good number of years ago, and I wonder what updating of that, both in terms of our better understanding of or growing understanding of climate impacts and a broader perspective on the communities that are impacted. Is that something we should be expecting the city? It gives a very fresh look at.
I think absolutely. And I do, I may be giving the city too much credit or the Boston Green Ribbon Commission too much credit, but I think they're on the job here, certainly with the flooding that worth checking.
Thank you.
Have we done our work for today, do you think?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Thank you
good.
all for joining us today.
Great.
We look forward to seeing you again in September, on September 14th, session 3. We will be discussing communities, ecosystems, and food. So hope you can join us then. If you have any questions in the interim, please feel free to reach out to me or Phil or Judy, anyone on our funder community team here.
Judy.
Okay.
Thank you,
Wonderful
Lynn.
afternoon.